Hello, so we are going to be presenting our African Liberation Project. We are group 3, so let's get started.
Hello, my name is Lianna Yanez. Welcome to our presentation, and I'm going to be starting by talking about colonialism in Africa. So, Africa was colonized for its resources like food and natural materials like gold, oil, iron, all of the materials that they had in Africa. So, that was one of the main reasons that different places like Europe and the United States wanted to come to Africa. Another thing is that they came to because of the slave trade and take indigenous people away from Africa to be used for slavery. The colonization in Africa led to so many issues that Africa still faces today, just like we've been learning in this class. There have been many issues that Africa faces, so colonization is one of the huge factors into why these issues still exist. During colonization, many people were using these treaties and handing them to the indigenous people that lived there, and it was really confusing for indigenous people because they had such a different way of life, and these coloners coming and asking them for papers for their land or just misinterpreting what they were and calling them savages and stuff like that led to a lot of like really horrible things happening. And one of the things was that there were these treaties that were written and they were like super complicated and used a lot of different words and making things really difficult, so that many tribe leaders just signed the papers and the treaties hoping that things will just go back to the way they were, but instead it led to their land being taken from them, and their land, their property, even stuff like their farms and things have been taken from them, which was just horrible. So those tactics were used to confuse many of the tribal leaders and people in Africa during colonization. So this just led to so many different issues in Africa that they still face today because of the like convoluted and really horrible things that happened during colonialism. Just like in the video we saw, there was a museum that was showing all the things in Africa, or the things in early tribes that were used as, oh, this was used as money, or this was used as like dress wear or something, but it was actually incorrect as stated by the person who made the documentary, who was actually native to Africa. So things like that, we can still see that Africa's dealing with a lot of misinformation and like blatant racism and things like that that are still troubling Africa today.
All right, so now we're going to discuss the apartheid in Africa, which lasted between 1948 and 1994. And apartheid would pretty much rule over Black Africans during this time and pretty much limited them to any type of freedoms. The word apartheid means separateness. It's a system of segregation based on race that ruled over South Africa during this time. Apartheid was enforced by the National Party. During this time, people were classified to 4 major categories, depending on race, and it was white, Indian, colored, and black. And even during this time, they would have different types of tests to determine what you would be classified as, and they would do what they call the pencil test, where they would put a pencil in your hair. If the pencil fell out of your hair, you'd be classified as white, unless you were a colored person, darker skin tone. They put the pencil in your hair and it stayed in your hair. You'd be determined as being black. Uh, Public schools were segregated between white and black. During this time, a lot of other things were too. Churches, hospitals, banks, any types of shops. Interracial marriages were banned during this time. So you never see a white person with a black person, or you'd be jailed. Um, they kept wages low for black Africans as well. This will keep them from gaining any kind of power or any type of major moves that really solidify themselves economically. Protesting was illegal as well. If you protested, you would get pretty harsh jail sentences, or maybe not even released at all. Also, during this time of apartheid, there were designated homelands, and they would force people to relocate. So they would cut off certain sectors of a country, and only white people could live in certain areas, and the black Africans would live in other areas. Usually in the black African areas, they were a little, I guess I'd say, not as up to date or well kept. Usually they kept the white areas pretty solidified with resources and pretty clean. And also during this time, black Africans, they're subjected to Bantu education, which I will get into a little later. All right, so now we're going to talk about the power of the African people and how they protested. In 1952, they had the Defiance Campaign, in which the South African people occupied spaces that were only meant for white people. Some of these spaces included churches, hospitals, banks, and other shops. The Sharpeville protest in 1960 was a peaceful protest where the people of Sharpeville were protesting against the use of pass books. And these pass books would include government permission to be in certain areas, like where they were allowed to be, employment info, work performance and behavior, and also fingerprints, their picture, their age. Another protest was a Soweto student uprising, and they were protesting the Bantu education. This education didn't allow for the students to be anything other than low-skilled workers in factories or in fields, pretty much hard labor jobs. All right, so we're going to continue with the power of the African people with movements. There are many of them, but this one is probably one of the most well-known ones and important ones of Steve Biko. We have here, that's who's pictured here on the right. He was a black South African apartheid activist. He helped create the South African Student Organization, also known as SASO, and he later soon after he became the president of the organization. SASO was a accumulation of South African students from many different countries. The philosophy of the organization was Black consciousness, which later started a movement, and that movement was the Black Conscious Movement, and they were still fighting for the liberation from apartheid rule and fighting against the Bantu education, which held many students back once they finished school. They focused on fighting for law changes. Some of those law changes included the pass books, which we discussed before, and the areas in which they were able to live, the segregation. one of the other things they also focused on was the psychological changes in the Black South Africans and establishing self-worth for the Black South Africans. All right, so we're going to continue with the power. So we're continuing with the power of the African people, and this is going to be talking about military force, the ANC, the African National Congress. They advocated for nonviolent resistance until the Sharpeville protests, where South African police opened fire on the people of Sharpeville. The African National Congress was founded in 1912. Nelson Mandela joined the African National Congress in 1944. After the Sharpeville protests, that's when they developed a military force. And it's called Inkanto Wisizwe, which means the spirit of the nation. The MK, was what many people call it, was the military branch of the ANC. And it was developed by Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, and Walter Sisulu briefly after the Sharpeville massacre. And the MK was created to fight against the South African government to protect the Black South Africans. They used a bunch of different tactics. They did a lot of military training. They did set bombs at government buildings or military buildings. Also, they would set landmines for government military to come across. So
Hi, so I'm going to be talking about pathways to contemporary liberation of Africa. There's three main factors that include social, political, and economic. So the first one is going to be social. So if we look at social, there's fragmentation that is an issue. There's a lot of cultural and institutionalized racism and xenophobia going on within the African community. So some solutions, like as we read in the text, include Black consciousness, and also just the social and cultural unity. We've read in text that it's really important for Africa to continue to improve and go back to the way it was by Africans sticking together. African people, excuse me. And then the next one is the political issues, like the broken democracy, the authoritarian and repressive governments. A lot of it is just like a fight of power. It's not really, they don't really think about the people. So some solutions include like organization, boycotting, and really educating everybody on the political views of what goes on in order for us to implement our own like rights and politics and ideas into the government. Next is economic factors. So it includes poverty. Africa, as we've heard, was exploited for their land, their resources, their people, and even the World Bank, which was implemented to help Africa or countries, but they actually do more harm than good. So some solutions to that can also include some debt relief, and just actual aid versus pretending to be aid.
Hi everybody, how's it going? My name's Camillo Geaga. I'm here to introduce my topic, which is social fragmentation. Through colonialism, racism was institutionalized to exploit Africans of their land, natural resources, and cheap labor. Divide and rule was a strategy used to control the masses, as whites were treated and viewed as superior. As a result, blacks were not only impoverished, but discriminated against in their own homeland. I think one solution is education. According to John Henry Clark in his film A Great Mighty Walk, history not only places someone within a context to know where he's coming from, but also what he must do. The African should learn about his or her glorious past of ancient empires, as well as colonization, which was also erased from textbooks. Education instills values which guide us. This self-awareness not only instills a sense of pride, it gives one a reclamation of humanity that uplifts. Another solution is Black Power, which is an identity that appreciates with reverence the heritage of Africans. Hi, everybody. My final solution is Pan-Africanism. The seeds of Pan-Africanism were planted during slavery years in the U.S. and flourished in the British West Indies. In 1900, a Pan-African League was created, but did not ask for independence of African states. Instead, for preparation through education of eventual independence. Du Bois was the leader. In 1912, an African National Congress was formed to unify all Africans. After World War I, Jamaican Marcus Garvey created the Universal Negro Improvement Association with the intent to bring Africans back to Africa on boats with the slogan, Africa for Africans. In 1945, a fourth Pan-African Congress was formed under Kwame Nkrumah, which led to the eventual independence of Ghana in 1957 from British rule during the end of the Civil Rights Movement. In 1963, an African Union was created, also known as the Organization of African Unity. And also in the 60s, Malcolm X left the Nation of Islam and founded the Organization for Afro-American Unity, in which he sought to bring the U.S. to the court in the United Nations for crimes against humanity. Pan-Africanism is the belief in the solidarity of all Africans and descent of Africans as a global movement. It's a strategy to break the divide and conquer mentality by the colonizer, a way to create a more unified effort towards resistance as an international community, and a desire to fight for basic humanity as a people. My final...
Hi, my name is Jude Ezechukwu, and I'm going to be talking about the broken democracy in Africa and the different factors that contributed to this issue. One of these factors being the authoritarian rule that was implemented by the colonists that inhabited these various African countries. This restricted the people of Africa to have little to no say on the things that go in the country, such as policies that would address the certain needs that they have, such as how the resources are allocated throughout the country. They're mostly just subject to whatever the authoritarian regime gave them. There was actually a few, coups that happened during this time. Some of them being U.S. backed. For example, an example of that would be the one that happened in the Republic of the Congo in 1960 that resulted in Mobutu Seko coming into power. And instead of him looking out for his people, he used that opportunity to seize that power and become a dictator. So essentially, reinforcing that authoritarian rule on his own people. This phenomenon wasn't uncommon during this time. People will actually, this happened like around different parts of Africa. People would get power, would actually successfully stage this coup and just abuse that power and do anything they can to stay in power, whether it's rigging elections or getting rid of the people that oppose them. Hi, my name is Jude Ezechukwu. I'm going to be talking about some possible solutions to fix Africa's broken democracy in various African countries. One of these solutions will be to get rid of these authoritarian regimes that are in place. This could be done through various forms of protest, such as boycotting and marching. So essentially, the people speaking out on the injustices that authoritarian regime caused until change actually happens, until they actually have a voice. When they do have a voice, they have to elect leaders that actually have what's in the best interest of the people. Leaders that focus on things like economic development and address the poverty issue that has been running rampant throughout Africa. Also leaders that fight for human rights and equality. In addition to that, there has to be enough leaders that could run the several territories throughout these African countries. Another solution will be to limit outside interference. That kind of goes hand in hand with economic development, because usually the countries that are less economically developed usually get involved with outside countries, or foreign countries, I should say. Because it's usually every time an African country gets involved with, for example, a European country, they always seem to do more harm than good in those situations. So I feel they're better off without these outside interferences.
So, the IMF and the World Bank were created to demolish poverty and help struggling nations. This started in 1944 when the IBRD was created to help reconstruct Europe after the war, which included lots of different things. But after Reconstruction ended and it was slowing down, there wasn't as much wartime and things like that, the World Bank shifted its focus on, instead of reconstruction, to ending poverty. So what that meant is that they began funding projects on many different topics like food production, nutrition, development, and even just helping struggling nations. As the bank grew, more and more people were introduced and began working at the bank. So this would include social scientists, anthropologists, and economic people, which is really great because they could provide more help for these struggling nations. So what the World Bank does is it provides low-income countries low-interest loans and low-interest credits and grants, which allows them to use the money towards things like food or rebuilding buildings after a natural disaster, or even just clean up after a natural disaster, or things like that. When the World Bank and IMF were created, it was seen as something super positive. Like, these people were going to come and demolish poverty. No nation in the world was going to have people who were dying of hunger or dying of disease or things like that. It seemed like a really great way to help third world countries. However, the IMF and the World Bank are far from perfect, and they do have a lot of problems. So now I'm going to be talking about some solutions to the World Bank and the IMF issues, specifically just debt relief, because now all the countries that have accepted loans from the IMF and the World Bank are now in debt, and it's really hard to kind of balance out that debt. So, so there've been a lot of protests and rallies in response to the debt that Africa has and how to solve it. A lot of African countries just want them to be released from this debt that they have, because in reality, the IMF and the World Bank haven't really helped Africa all too much. But some of the solutions that I came up with was that African countries need to be cautious when doing new loans. I think if they look really carefully at what the loans are and what they're going to be helping the country with overall and see if it's worth it, and then they could just be careful with dealing with the new loans. I also think that they can create new borrowing strategies to help the government. So this could help with increasing money for themselves and gaining more money to help service their debts. So that would be really good. The next is that the government should be prepared to deal with price fluctuations, because as the economy gets better, things will kind of get all wonky with the pricing. So they just need to be ready to deal with that and not panic if it goes lower, and not think they can spend a whole bunch if it gets higher either. I also think that Africa shouldn't depend on commodity exports to help the company, because there's so many things that they could be doing. And while exports is a huge part of Africa's economy, that shouldn't be the one factor that they're thinking of to help the economy. I also think that they should develop self-reliable growth. So, like creating new things for more jobs, but also just having like stable incomes and things to allow more stable and reliable growth, not things like, the produce stuff and exports, because that can switch and fluctuate. So they should have something that's really reliable. So continuing on with the problems that the IMF and the World Bank have, the IMF was created in 1945, and it monitored rate exchanges and stabilized monetary systems and encouraged financial cooperation. So what the IMF does is it helps collapsing economies from harming other economies by giving loans and helping them stabilize their economy. However, the IMF serves the interests of the United States and the European Union, so these things that are supposed to be helping countries are skewed to also help the United States and the European Union. In 2008, a financial crisis hit Africa, and a lot of African countries hit really hard and had huge economic struggles. As mentioned in the video, what is the International Monetary Fund? The demand for imported goods from Africa declined, and so the growth rates slowed down, and this was really hard for many African countries. However, the IMF completely ignored these issues and gave money to places like Ghana, which supported their economy and increased their growth rate, but it doesn't help the other struggling countries that may have not gotten that money. So the IMF was criticized because the IMF, whoever invests more money into the IMF will end up receiving more voting rights. So a lot of countries have no choice but to accept help from the IMF, even if they can't pay back these loans and cause more debt, or even if the IMF's plans aren't in the best interest of the country at all. So I'm not going to read off all of these, but some of the African countries that have World Bank loans, only World Bank loans, include Liberia, Chad, Congo Republic, Benin, Egypt, Zimbabwe. So many countries have World Bank loans, and who knows how big those loans are, but they're probably going to be waiting a long time to pay those off, which is really sad. So now I'm going to be talking about some solutions to the World Bank and the IMF issues, specifically just debt relief, because now all the countries that have accepted loans from the IMF and the World Bank are now in debt, and it's really hard to kind of balance out that debt. So Yeah, so there have been a lot of protests and rallies in response to the debt that Africa has and how to solve it. A lot of African countries just want them to be released from this debt that they have, because in reality, the IMF and the World Bank haven't really helped Africa all too much. But some of the solutions that I came up with was that African countries need to be cautious when doing new loans. I think if they look really carefully at what the loans are and what they're going to be helping the country with overall, and see if it's worth it, and then they could just be careful with dealing with the new loans. I also think that they can create new borrowing strategies to help the government. So this could help with increasing money for themselves and gaining more money to help service their debts. So that would be really good. The next is that the government should be prepared to deal with price fluctuations, because as the economy gets better, things will kind of get all wonky with the pricing. So they just need to be ready to deal with that and not panic if it goes lower, and not think they can spend a whole bunch if it gets higher either. I also think that Africa shouldn't depend on commodity exports to help the company, because there's so many things that they could be doing. And while exports is a huge part of Africa's economy, that shouldn't be the one. So now I'm going to be talking about some solutions